Recently I have seen arguments against free will gain further traction, especially in religious debates, and it led me to think about how a libertarian free will might actually be possible. It will not necessarily be my aim in this video to even provide an account of free will that seems likely to you, although in the religious context you may think it could be, but just to establish that free will as such is possible, and that the arguments against it so far fail. I am not claiming that this account of free will is a Christian, Islamic, or any other faith-based account of free will. That's not so much for me to say. But unless there is some defense of free will, the argument against free will might pose a serious problem for these religions. I have responded to an argument against free will by Alex O'Connor before on my channel, where he discusses the inconceivability of free will on an intrinsic level, that everything we want to do, we want to do. And therefore we are never in control of our wants by means of this infinite regress. Put simply, I believe such an argument fails because it neglects the possibility of some highest desire and its binary opposite, both being available for free desire to attach to. But if you are interested, I would highly recommend watching. The argument I have seen Alex put forward more recently is a little different. Free will in the libertarian sense is usually taken as the ability to have acted differently in any given situation. Ability being the important word, which is meant to refer to such an action being somehow internally and intentionally caused. If the causal chain begins with some external event, then clearly you did not have the ability to act different, even if another event may have happened. But then, furthermore, if your internal causal state happened randomly, then it would also seem inaccurate to describe this as an ability, since no meaningful intention could have been the cause of a random action. And this is fundamentally the crux of Alex's argument, that a libertarian free will is impossible, because all will to action is either caused, and therefore dictated by something external, or it is uncaused, and therefore it is random. If we grant that a free action cannot be random nor externally caused, it is clear what alternative there is that we must try to justify. The only fruitful alternative will be to argue that desire or the will is self-caused, which is clearly what the libertarians must essentially argue. If it is possible for something to exist in a self-caused, meaningful, and non-random manner, then we have a good candidate for how free desires could take place. Granted that we can establish the possibility of something self-caused which meets these criteria, the free will skeptic will have further work to do to argue that free will cannot exist. Let us first establish the possibility of self-caused things existing as such. The idea of self-caused things has been a key factor in our historical understanding of metaphysics. The idea comes up when exploring how existence came to be, through the form of arguments of the first mover, and so forth. It seems natural that when considering a chain of causal events, eventually this chain must find its origin in something more fundamental, not reliant upon anything else, but somehow existing on its own accord. This type of self-caused being is not random either. Instead, it's normally argued that such a being might exist out of its own omnipotent power and by means of its own omnibenevolent nature, meaning it exists in such a manner which it seems fit, and indeed causes everything which arises from it by means of its own intentions or will. If one who denies free will denies the possibility of this form of self-causation, there is a more fundamental problem to attack than free will itself, but typical religious notions of an original creator as such. But these attacks are in essence weak. Not only does it seem conceivable that such a property will or could exist, but the whole reason these arguments became popular is that it seems necessary for such a property to exist. Without it, these philosophers have claimed much of existence is unintelligible. One might also point to quantum indeterminacy as evidence of something self-caused, but we might also wonder how anything at all can exist without granting the possibility of self-causation. Perhaps the only other explanation of how original things come to be is the idea that they have a necessary existence. But again, this also seems hard to separate from self-causation entirely. If something exists necessarily and is original, if we grant the possibility of such an existence, nonetheless it exists of its own accord and has aspects of its form by virtue of its own nature, and nothing else. If one wishes to abandon the idea of self-causation for necessary existence only, they should be careful that they are not offering us something just as complex to explain, and they might also be committed to the claim that indeterministic events, such as on the quantum level, involve no self-causation whatsoever. Again, if anything other than determinism is true, abandoning self-causation seems to pose a massive problem. Self-causation need not be assumed to be random in itself either, since anything self-cause exists by definition through its own telos for existing. And we certainly wouldn't want to make the claim that a self-caused God is random by nature either. And so we have discussed the plausibility of self-caused things in general. Now it is left to establish that self-caused desires might be possible without running into the problems of external dependency or randomness. The reason this might prove difficult is that an accurate account of self-causation seems to suggest that some event happens in complete causal isolation from other sequences of events, and therefore must happen in a disconnected and seemingly random manner. However, it is important to establish the difference between unpredictability and randomness in this case. If something happens because of self-causation, there is no doubt a causal element unobservable from an outside perspective. While this will allow for the possibility of entirely unpredictable events from the outside, this does not mean that the internal, self-causal structure did not have a telos or purpose. In other words, it is plausible that only an appearance of randomness exists. One way to understand how this might be a possibility is by attributing a metaphysically causal power to certain beings or things. By this I mean that causal powers might be exercised in two different ways. Either I am caused to move, and my motion by following some physical law causes something else to move as well, or a metaphysical power is exercised, such as the power to reduce the number of possible worlds which follow this moment. The reduction of the number of possible worlds following this moment need not happen because of something which happens in the physical world right now, but instead could take place because metaphysical possibilities are changing. And this could be by virtue of a metaphysical power being exerted. This is in essence how I would imagine self-caused things taking place in general. Something has a metaphysical power which, when exerted, reduces the number of possible worlds until only possible worlds where it begins to exist take place. Nonetheless, the other examples of this self-causation which we can imagine appear very unalike. On the one hand, we have an omnipotent power which exists in some necessary form, and on the other hand, maybe we have seemingly random quantum events. Another criticism of self-caused things is that they cannot interact with time in any meaningful way, because in essence they must be spontaneous by nature. The idea behind this is that whatever the truly self-caused component of something is something that in theory could have taken place at any moment in which it was possible for it to do so, and may not have taken place in the moment which it did, and took place because of nothing specific in that span of time either. While it could therefore have been caused purposefully, it nonetheless has an element of spontaneity. And so how could a desire come about in relation to an actual instance in time where a choice must be made? There are two possible solutions which appeal to me, both of which involve an atemporal environment. When a choice must be made, I can imagine the possibility of a related atemporal environment being brought into existence where a possible self-caused desire can come to exist. So long as the desiring being is bound to end up self-causing some desire or another, in this environment such a being will begin to have some desire structure. Rather than having a direct causal relationship with the temporal sequence, this desiring spirit, so to speak, could have its will enacted in the temporal sequence by means of some external power, such as a god. The creature could have had the ability to act otherwise had it desired otherwise, but its desires were implemented by necessity of some external power. If one is to deny this possibility, arguing that for something to self-cause within time is a contradiction, there is still one further solution, though we have explored reasons to doubt such an objection. One might also suppose that one's entire desire structure is atemporal or eternal in a self-caused manner, and that while I was born with this structure and my decisions were determined thereafter, I nonetheless had the ability to have acted differently, since my desires were originally grounded in my own nature. While this would imply there may not necessarily be options open to me in the future, nonetheless I could legitimately have acted differently, and my self-caused nature could be as related to the actual actions I am making as is necessary for it to be considered a meaningful choice. This would leave me in a similar situation to the free will denier in affirming some sort of practical free will, or having faith in my ability to choose, knowing on some level my choice is already determined. However, in this model, this faith has more meaning, since the decisions I am making I am accountable for in some absolute sense, and therefore they might also maintain a stronger moral character than in the case of the free will denier. One final objection might be that God, in allowing me to exist, has essentially chosen the type of person which will exist, and therefore has essentially caused my nature. However, there is nothing to say that something self-caused could not be bound in part to certain limitations, while retaining a relevant freedom. For example, God might manifest my desires by virtue of a subset of their components, making some of my desires determined and others free. The more interesting question this debate raises, in my opinion, is whether the concept of free will poses a difficulty to cosmological arguments or first mover arguments in general. If the religious believer wishes to grant libertarian free will, it seems they need some generative causal power attributed to the individual, which might throw doubts over the argument that only God can act as a first cause. While solutions may exist, such as self-causing things needing some sort of prior structure to act within, or that their generative power might in essence be borrowed or something similar from a divine creator, this would definitely be an interesting line for an atheist to take. But let me know your thoughts in the comments. Do you agree with this? Let me know any problems that you had with it, and I'll be happy to have any further conversations with you. Love and peace.